friends, I am Dr. Kuldeep Mohadikar. In this video, I am going to present my sixth chapter from my series Literary Pearls, entitled as John Donne as a Religious Poet. John Donne is one of the greatest of English religious poets and the poets of the 17th century, on whom his influence was most deep and lasting were all religious poets. A man of religious temperament who is constantly aware, constantly perceiving the underlying unity, the fundamental oneness of all underlying phenomena, and that is perception of such a relationship, such an inherent principle of unity is revealed even by the imagery of the earliest poetry of Donne. John Donne's religious poetry belonged to the later part of his career, to the period after his ordination, and the gloom, despair and frustration which resulted from death of his wife, poverty and ill health. The best of Donne's religious poetry was written only during the last phase of his career, but the nature of his imagery, even the early one, clearly indicates that his genius was religious and he was bound to take to religious poetry and to the pulpit. Donne's chief power as a religious poet is shown in the holy sonnets and the last hymns. Only in the hymn to God, the Father, do we find an assured faith. Elsewhere, there is always an element of conflict and doubt or fear. The best of the holy sonnets express these struggles with unparalleled force. I quote, "Wilt thou forgive that sin where, be in which was my sin, though it were done before?" I unquote. As in the love poetry, in religious poetry, too, there is a considerable variety of tone and method, ranging from mere debating tricks to a profound urgency and conviction, and sometimes both may be found in the same poem. They best show the characteristic wit reinforcing the emotional intensity. I quote, "Only thou art above, and when towards these by the lew I can look, I rise again, but our old subtle for so tempteth me, that not one hour myself I can sustain." I unquote. And as Donne, first of the metaphysical love poets, he is likewise the first of introspective Anglican religious poets of 17th century. Elizabethan and a good deal of Jacobean religious poetry is didactic in tone and Protestant and Calvinist, but not distinctly Anglican. The theme of the frailty and decay of his world is generally the subject of Donne's religious poems. Like many of the intellectuals of his day, Donne felt that the times were out of joint, and it seems obvious that the world was rapidly accelerating in its process of degeneration and decomposition as it approached the end of its course. Other important themes of Donne's religious poems are the insignificance of man himself, the antithesis between the world and the spirit, the transitoriness and the unsatisfactoriness of all early enjoyments, pangs suffered by the soul in the imprisoning body. Thus he writes in second anniversaries, "And what essentially joy canst thou expect? Here upon earth, what permanent effect of transitory causes dost thou love beauty?" Like Donne's love poetry, his religious poetry also bears an unmistakable stamp of his personality. It is not written in a conventional didactic style, bringing home to the readers certain religious doctrines, and on the other hand, it is highly individualistic and personal, as all Donne's poetry is, and it gives expression to his highly complex personality. Donne's best religious poetry is intensely personal, we can say. There are always the otherworldly element in Donne, a certain detachment from life or non attachment, but although he increasingly felt that the world was vanity, he could never quite liberated himself from it. Donne's divine poems are the product of conflict between his will and his temperament. In his love poetry, he is not concerned with what he ought not to feel, but with the expression of feeling itself. Passion is there its own justification, and so is disgust or hatred or grief. In his divine poetry, feeling and thoughts are judged by the standard of what a Christian should feel or think. As a love poet, he seems to owe nothing to what any other man in love had ever felt and said before him. His language is all his own. As a divine poet, he cannot escape using the language of the Bible and the hymns and prayers or remembering the mood of Christian rites. The truth of Donne's love poetry is truth of the imagination, which freely transmutes personal experience. They are his own discoveries. The truth of revelation is the accepted basis of his religious poetry, and imagination has here another task. It is to some extent fettered. But all the divine poems are not the records of discoveries, but of struggles to appropriate a truth which has been revealed. The truth does not defeat all poetry, but gives us a poetry whose intensity is a moral intensity. Some religious poetry, Herbert's, perhaps can be regarded as a species of love poetry, but Donne is not of that kind. The image of Christ as a lover appears is only in only two of his poems, both written soon after the death of his wife. The image which dominates his divine poetry is the image of Christ, a savior, the victor over sin and death. The strength with his imagination presents this figure is the measure of his need, and that need is the subject of the finest of his religious poems. So that's all from my side on John Donne as a religious poets. Thanks, friends.